So this is our 5th Wednesday Wisdom webinar this year. It's very hard to say, and it's actually one of the first to fall on a Wednesday, so that's good. We wanted to set up this webinar as blue carbon is really becoming a hot topic, particularly for our funders. And I can't count how many people have said to me this year, have you got any of these blue carbon thingies? And it's mostly corporates, but it's also individual and institutional donors. And what we're trying to navigate is, what does that mean? We know that nature-based solutions or locking in carbon via protecting habitats and landscapes is a really important component to helping us reach global climate targets. We know that carbon credits on land and at sea are or could be a major way to help fund this transition, but there are so many pitfalls that we need to be aware of. And what we hope today is that we can have a good discussion after the main presentations about how we can best play a part in advancing this movement as regranters, connectors, fundraisers, project developers, to come up with genuine solutions which have integrity and benefits to biodiversity as well as local communities on top of the all essential carbon metrics. So we're going to have about 30 minutes, 3 different talks. We'll then invite some of our directors, hopefully from around the world, to say a couple of words about blue carbon projects or this area that we're supporting around seagrasses, mangroves and other habitats. And then hopefully we'll have a decent amount of time for questions. So all the kind of normal bossy housekeeping rules apply. Go on mute if you're not speaking. Feel free to put questions in the chat and use the kind of hand raise function during the Q&A. And I hope it's okay with everyone, but we are recording because there were several people where the time difference didn't work, but they wanted to join. So I think that's all from me, and over to Mark.
Hello, hi everyone. Let me see if I can just quickly share my screen for you. Okay, can everyone see our team in the field there?
You can now, yes.
Yeah, excellent. Cool. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark. I'm a mangrove ecologist, and years ago I studied how carbon moves around in mangrove ecosystems. And at the time, nobody was really interested, but currently it's a bit of a hot topic. And I work for an organisation called Fair Carbon. And what we're trying to do is create accessible information for both buyers and creators of carbon credits, because this is a really complicated landscape, and there's a lot of misinformation and assumptions flying around, which make it really difficult to navigate and get started. So today, I'm going to quickly try and summarise what blue carbon ecosystems are, how carbon credits work, and see if I can do that in 2 minutes, and then quickly outline why this is important before handing over to Karen and Dan. There we go. So blue carbon ecosystems are basically vegetated coastal ecosystems, which naturally store carbon both in their biomass, which is their wood and branches, leaves, and also which trap any other bits of organic carbon that might be floating around and store it in the sediment in their root structures. And because these are quite permanent root structures, they can hold that sediment in place and lock that carbon away for quite a long time. Just realised there's a tape measure in this. This is a field site I worked on in Singapore years ago. Measuring carbon is sadly a bit more complicated than a tape measure. So the 3 systems that we generally refer to as blue carbon ecosystems are mangroves, seagrass, which is it's a vascular plant. It's not a seaweed. It is a different thing. It's a bit like having your garden lawn but growing underwater at huge scales. Although it's a true flowering plant. And salt marsh, which doesn't have all the attention and love that the other systems have yet, but is one we have a really good scientific basis for. Now, these 3 systems, they all have in common that they are vegetated. They all source carbon around their bases and sediment. And with the exception of seagrass, they're quite accessible. So we've been able to study them and figure out how they work for quite some time. So it's a good scientific basis for these. They're not the only systems in the ocean that store carbon. There are massive oceanic carbon pumps that transfer carbon from the surface waters right down to the deep ocean. There's all sorts of complicated stuff going on. But these are the systems where we have enough evidence to measure and make a difference in how carbon is moved around. And that's the key point, is that we can make a difference. But I quickly want to highlight that while we talk about blue carbon, we tend to focus on it in a lot of these discussions. For me personally, being able to produce carbon credits and then sell them is a way of funding actions which can make a difference for people and for biodiversity. And it's not the be-all and end-all. These systems do a lot more than just store carbon. They provide food, building wood, they support fisheries, they support biodiversity, and they can also protect coastal communities from being hit by the worst effects of typhoons and flooding. There's a lot of talk about some of the other ocean ecosystems out there and whether they should be monetized with credits or not. Some have potential. There's potential in kelp, for example, and other seaweeds, but we need more science to back that up. And for others, really, we shouldn't have to monetize everything to value it. And we should really be advocating for stronger policy to protect a lot of the other systems at a much more wide-ranging level. Because obviously anything to do with credit is only carried out locally. So it's not a gigantic global effect. Right, I'm so sorry for all the text. I'm going to try and run through how the carbon market works in 10 steps. This could be a world first. Feel free to challenge me on it afterwards, and there is more on our website, faircarbon.org. How you create nature-based carbon credits. You have mangroves, seagrass, or salt marsh which are damaged or threatened. If you can intervene in that and make a difference, so you restore them or you stop the destruction, then you've made a measurable difference in the amount of carbon that's being stored or being released. If you can measure that difference, then for industries or companies which are unable to completely reduce their emissions to zero, which have a bit of some leftovers which they can't actually get rid of, for them being able to balance out their emissions by buying those carbon credits is really important. So what we are saving through our interventions in these ecosystems, that can be balanced out. That can balance out what's still being emitted in other places. It's not simple. It's intensely complicated. Measuring anything in nature is intensely complicated. So super quick. Once you've figured out how you can intervene and make a difference, you go to a carbon standard, which is an agency that monitors what you're doing for the whole project lifetime, so normally several decades. It's the same agency that double check your homework, make sure you're doing things right, and then they issue an amount of credits based on the difference you've made. To measure the difference you're making, use a methodology. So methodologies and standards are different. The methodology is a set of instructions that a standard gives you and says this is what you have to stick to, for us to know that the work you're doing is legitimate, and then we can issue credits based on that. And if you variate from that, then no go. We have to know that this is real. So you do interventions, you do your activities, you make a difference, we save some lovely nature, and then a third party, so normally a scientist from somewhere else that's unrelated either to your project or to the carbon standard, they come along and they double check that what you've done meets the standards requirements and also roughly sticks to what you've planned in the first place. So a third party comes in and says, yep, this works. And only when the third party say it's okay, will the standard say, yep, okay, you've done it the right way, you've measured a difference, we're going to issue some credits based on that difference. And we've got someone else here who says, yep, they double checked it, it's fine. And then hopefully the income you can make from selling those credits is going to be enough to cover the cost of implementing your project, support the needs of the people that live there, because with coastal ecosystems, there are always people living nearby, and there are always other people involved who, they need to have to be at the front of what you're doing when you're designing a project. And then we have to keep up this cycle for 10, 20, 30 years. So it's really not easy. It's probably the first time I've seen someone try and do this in 10 steps. And the 10th step, which is why we exist, because this is such a complicated process, and because we're still in the early days, really, there's not a vast amount of people out there who are lucky enough to have been able to access the education or have had the niche interest to know how this works and be able to give you good advice. So we're trying to distill best practice from the technical side, from the social side, and from the legal and political side into one step-by-step guide, starting with mangroves, which we hope will enable more smaller local groups to be able to implement their own projects and to do it in a really good way. And that's how we see making a difference, really, is sending lots of small projects that make a huge local impact. I'm not watching the time, so I hope I'm still good. Just as a quick reality check, we've known how to do this for 10 years. Excuse me, the first project was Makaka Pamoja, and it's Makaka Pamoja's 10th birthday coming up. But in 10 years, there are only 33 projects producing registered. Most of those registered projects aren't producing credits yet, and around half registered this year. And we saw this big upswing this year, driven by the emerging interest, driven by the need for credits by companies that want to offset, and also driven by an increase in credit price. It wasn't viable before for a lot of these to exist. Now we're seeing it become more viable. So we're seeing a quick increase. With any quick increase and any sudden spike in demand and any opportunity to make money, we have to be very careful how these things develop. We have seen, in the Red Plus space, we have seen some really poor conduct happen. We've seen exploitative conduct, we've seen bad maths, we've seen all this stuff before. One of the things which we have to be very mindful of is this doesn't happen again. And something which surprised us when we set out to provide guidance for project design was that we were approached by a lot of corporates and other organisations, and a couple of governments even, who were also struggling to access clear information about how this process worked and how they should interact with it in an ethical way. So a lot of our work has actually been not just providing guidance for people who are working on the ground, but actually being a conduit of information from the ground to people who are making decisions in boardrooms around the world, and really getting that knowledge and that shared perspective across the whole value chain. And at that point, this seems like a good junction to introduce Karen. So I'm going to be quiet there. I hope I've not gone over, and I'll answer some questions later on. Thanks, everyone.
If you unshare your slides, Mark, Karen should be able to share hers.
Thank you. I am going to try and be technologically as proficient as Mark was. We'll see if it works. Great. Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here with all of you today and to talk about some of the work that we have been doing with our partners to take the concepts that Mark has just walked through and make sure that as this market develops, we are, as a community, harnessing that market for good, not exploiting it. Very briefly, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, which I lead, is a multi-stakeholder, really multi-solver alliance of over 70 organizations, which includes governments, the private sector, primarily finance and insurance, and civil society, all working together to look at how we can effectively drive investment into coastal and ocean ecosystems through finance and insurance products. And one of the issues that has kept coming up over the past several years, particularly over the last year since COP26, which was in Glasgow, was the question of blue carbon, as Mark indicated, and the question of how we try to get that marketplace built, how we nurture it in a way that is exercising this triple benefit as an investment for people, for nature, and for climate. So essentially, just after the Glasgow COP, we joined together with Salesforce, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, and the World Economic Forum's Friends of Ocean Action to look at how we could, through a radical collaboration, bring together key stakeholders to really go through a consultative and iterative process to develop some of these blue high quality principles and guidance for investments into blue carbon. And it took about a year to go through. And in essence, I think what was really important was that we were thinking about the audience, both focused on demand and supply, looking at investors, suppliers, brokers in the process, that we wanted to convene key stakeholders who were involved in the blue carbon community and provide guidance moving forward. As Mark said, we've all seen the experience in the terrestrial space of the emergence of a market that was highly unregulated, some bad actors entering the fray, and what that has meant. And because oddly, the ocean community and investment into the ocean is always a little behind what happens on land, we wanted to try and take advantage of that space to learn from what had happened in the past on land, but also take into account and consideration what we needed to do in the water and on the coasts in order to develop some of these high quality principles and guidelines. Of course, the most important thing here is to think about, the biggest and most important asset on our planet, really hiding in plain sight, which is nature, and making sure that rather than viewing it as an unvalued or undervalued externality, bringing it into this kind of asset class that needs to be built. And our challenge was how we as a group could nurture this emerging blue carbon market to prevent market abuse. So we came up with 5 principles, which I'm going to walk through as quickly as I can. There'll be a QR code at the end, which you can focus on and get access to the document. So don't worry, and all of these slides are available afterwards, I'm sure, as well. But the 5 principles are, and they're in no particular order: safeguarding nature, empowering people, employing the best available information and carbon accounting principles, operating contextually and locally, and finally, mobilizing high integrity capital. So just very quickly, I'm going to gallop through these. So firstly, thinking about safeguarding nature, making sure that we are both conserving remaining intact ecosystems and restoring ecosystems so that, in essence, we do no harm. Empowering people means making sure that free, prior, and informed consent is established, that the voices of Indigenous peoples, women, and marginalized groups are included through inclusive project design and governance, as well as the management of those projects. Making sure there's relevant gender integration, that there are accountability and grievance mechanisms, respect for traditional land use and legal rights, equitable access to the global voluntary carbon markets, and empowering local communities to define equitable benefits. The third principle is focused on employing the best information, interventions, and carbon accounting practices. And really, this is focused on taking account of the local circumstances, as well as scientific, traditional, and local knowledge, making sure that there's transparency in the accounting mechanisms that are used, establishing accurate carbon baselines, critically demonstrating additionality and durability, which Mark has spoken to a little bit, and I'll add to. And when we talk about blue carbon ecosystems, durability is over decades, which is something that's really important to take into account. Having measures in place that mitigate the risk of reversal, management protocols, and then also weighing the trade-offs between the actual and anticipated credit types. The fourth principle is focused on operating locally and contextually, and I'm sure Dan is going to speak to us more about that, but making sure that that local, social, and ecological context, as well as I would add cultural context, is taken into account, making sure that the focus is on high quality blue carbon project development, and ensuring that there is participation and that there is a network involved in the project that includes local and government partners to ensure its success and longevity. And then finally, of course, mobilizing that high integrity capital. So ensuring that we are setting science-based targets that are focused on reducing emissions. And this goes to the additionality of these projects. We want to make sure that these projects, particularly for the corporate sector engaging, are additional to their commitments to achieving the 1.5 degree target. Of course, what we all know who work in the ocean space is that unless we hit that net zero target, any of the extra efforts that we make are going to be compromised. And so it's really important that these types of credits are additional to achieving that net zero goal. And then finally, ensuring that there is equity and fairness, that, as I've mentioned before, that there's transparency, that these credits are fairly priced, that they are for mutual benefit for stakeholders. So in some of the evolving projects that are being developed, some of the local communities are not seeing the benefits coming out of them. Governments see this as an opportunity to earn money that doesn't necessarily have to go back to local communities. And so really focusing on that equity and fairness issue is critical. And this goes as well for those investors, as we think about high integrity capital, to the issue of patient capital for those investments. So these projects take a long time to develop, as we've heard. The returns are not going to be immediate, and we need to focus on the impact as well as the returns from these investments. So really what the principles try to do is to be a call to action, looking at corporates as well as others joining as early adopters and contributors, looking at the development of best-in-class applications, and then, of course, sharing case studies and learning as this community of practice develops. So just a snapshot of, we released these principles at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We have seen the core group being joined by these over 70 participants, key contributors, including Blue Marine Foundation and Fair Carbon being involved, and early adopters to trial these principles are on the screen as well. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the high quality Blue Carbon Principles and Guidance webpage with all the detail can be found at that QR code, which we can share again later. But, just wanted to give that brief overview of where we are. And really, I think as we develop this market, the key now is how we flip the script to ensure high quality. And I know Dan is going to talk about how we do that. And so, Dan, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Okay. Are we all good? Can you see it? Okay, great. Good to see so many people tuned in and some familiar faces. It's a good community, this, and good to see it growing and emerging and thriving around the world. And thanks to the Conservation Collective and Jade for putting it on and for inviting us to speak. So, I mean, I'd call this opportunities, realities and risks, and really it's reflections that come from the last couple of years of talking to people all day, every day, both projects and practitioners and the people that are actually in mangrove swamps and salt marshes, slightly less glamorously, and scientists who are trying to understand all of this, and local communities who are also trying to understand all of this, and investors and everyone else who are also trying to, there's a common theme that this stuff is not properly understood yet. But yeah, I have those conversations as part of my work with Blue Marine Foundation, where I'm currently the director of Ocean and Climate, and I'm very happy to lead a small group within Blue that's focused on trying to better understand and appreciate the value of the ocean as a climate change solution, not just within our projects. We have about 45 different conservation projects around the world, but beyond too, and to try and establish templates and pilot projects and examples of how this can work at a range of different scales for a range of different people, and primarily for nature itself. And to do that, we are working with all sorts of different scientific institutions, technology providers, and local communities to try and shape policy that bring rigor and transparency and robustness to the evidence around this topic. So I first became engaged in this when a corporate partner of ours asked us to look for blue carbon projects to the scale of 1.6 million tonnes per annum, which at a very conservative price estimate of $10 per tonne would have yielded $100 million over their initial 5-year period that they wanted to invest for. And as someone who goes out and speaks to people donating into conservation projects all the time, that's obviously a very attractive quantum. It's a huge amount of money, and a huge amount of money for marine conservation and restoration is exactly what we need. The ocean's critically underfunded, receives under 1% of total environmental giving or something like that. And what I know Jade's experiencing, what we've all experienced, I think, is that there's a huge investor appetite out there, but a lack of any knowledge, particularly about what they actually want, and what that actually means. And I actually think philanthropy is more necessary than it ever has been before in this space. And I'm encouraged to see philanthropists coming into this space and donating at the scale that's needed to make some of these things investable and to make real some of these opportunities. And I'll just talk around opportunities and some risks and other things, and then I'll go into a little more detail on a couple of projects. But as Mark alluded to, there's a huge amount of focus on carbon. Carbon is the entry point, the quantifiable entry point by which people understand these habitats and the things that they do. And from an investment standpoint, that's the way into this world. But really, it's incredibly reductive, as we know. Each of these different habitats provides innumerable co-benefits. In fact, innumerable is probably the wrong word, because ourselves and lots of others are working extremely hard to try and quantify what those co-benefits are and how they could be valued concurrently alongside carbon. As I'll get onto in a second, not all blue carbon habitats have the potential, not all project locations that have blue carbon habitats have the potential to be economically viable carbon projects. And therefore, understanding all of the other valuable things that these habitats offer to society and to communities is extremely important. And, building on what Karen said, the key thing here is transparency and robust evidence and social equity. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on a couple of things I've experienced in that field. Sorry, I'm just trying to change slides. The reality is, as Mark alluded to, is that we're simply not there with scientific evidence, even for the most well understood of these habitats. Mangroves far further ahead than the others. But for seagrass and salt marsh, which are kind of very much considered conventional blue carbon habitats, when you get down to the nitty gritty, there's a lack of proper understanding on a project specific basis. As Mark says, it's 10 years since the first of these projects came online. But as we're seeing in the UK, we don't even really know where our seagrass is yet. And in sort of, I guess for the project managers on the call, for the different people involved, it is a question of scale. Do the costs of measuring, monitoring, reporting, going through the verification of a project stack up against the potential carbon sequestration? And we're approached a lot by places with incredible marine ecosystems, marine habitats, mangroves and seagrass, but there simply isn't enough of it, or it's too fragmented, or there isn't any restoration potential, or it's already protected for any kind of additionality at a scale that can warrant a carbon market project, given current verification methodologies and the cost of verification, which hopefully will shift over time to allow smaller projects to come online. There's a lot of regulatory confusion too, not just on a local level, but also on a global level. People don't really understand Article 6 and what it's going to mean. Central governments, in theory, have to provide a letter of authority to allow voluntary carbon market projects to proceed. They have to take credits out of their national inventory. But when you get into the details, even the people who wrote Article 6 don't quite understand how that's going to play out in the real world. So all of that's to say, blue carbon's not really a silver bullet. It's an incredibly exciting topic, but there's a lot more to be understood before we get there. And I'm already seeing live project examples where local communities have lost out. I use an example where I've seen a project. I've seen blue carbon credits being sold for $40 a ton in London, being bought for $25 a ton and then being resold for $40 a ton. And knowing the sort of provenance of those credits, know that the local community in that instance got 84 cents. So kind of jumping ahead to the opaque pricing point on the slide, do not, for the project managers on the call, these are incredibly valuable assets and they should be priced as high as possible. I know, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, I believe, is planning to underwrite credits from the Bahamas at $75 a ton. And I think selling early and selling at the wrong level is potentially a risk, and allowing credits to go into secondary and tertiary markets where they're sold with no benefit to the local communities is again a real shame, and really draw everyone's attention to the high quality principles that Karen mentioned. It's really worth downloading them and poring over them, because they're incredible distillation of knowledge from so many different organizations about the right way to approach this. And I'll just run, and a final point around carbon cowboys, which was a term that, you know, seemed to be very live at COP. And I spent a lot of time in the terrestrial pavilion and the indigenous pavilion at COP, because it was fascinating to see how far ahead and the sort of backlash against carbon cowboys. And I was having supper with a friend who's a banker at COP, and I was sort of bemoaning these carbon cowboys. And he said, listen, you can have all the regulation in the world, and there's still lots of practice that goes on. I mean, just look at banking. And it hit home that really it's our responsibility to subscribe to principles, but that's never going to protect everyone and every project. So it's up to every project to really understand this stuff. A few very quick examples of projects that we're working on. We're restoring a huge area of seascape in the south of England, really driving lots of money into scientific evidence to underpin that, and using a lot of new technology, which we're really excited about, to properly quantify all sorts of different things, including nitrate removal and the potential for biodiversity credits to go alongside carbon credits. We've also initiated this Blue Carbon Rights project, which is just kicking off, and the goal of that is really to understand community relationships with blue carbon habitats and their co-benefits, to identify community champions from around the world and empower their voices to speak in international fora about blue carbon, and ultimately to support people like Mark in the provision of legal and land tenure support. And we'll be holding a workshop on that early next year, and we'll invite lots of people on this call to attend. We've also initiated this UK Blue Carbon Forum with lots of peers. The last meeting had 80 different attendees. It's fantastic to see. It's interfacing with DEFRA and has huge potential to drive change. And I think that's a key point from my perspective to leave on, really, is there's so many different groups working on this topic. There's so many different stakeholder groups that don't speak each other's language yet. You know, even between the NGO practitioners who restore seagrass and the ones like me who are interested in enabling a market, we speak totally different languages. And that the same goes for communities and investors and everything else. So I'd urge organisations on the call who are looking to develop projects to speak to people like Mark, who understand all the different levels of this conversation, and to attend the different forums that are being set up, and to share knowledge, share ideas, and hopefully to drive change over time. A final thing that we're working on is trying to understand everything else. As Mark alluded to, there's a lot more than just seagrass and salt marsh, and we're putting a substantial amount of money into trying to understand the wider seascape and how humans impact on it, ultimately with the goal of changing the way the world sees the ocean in relation to the climate. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. Wow, that was just brilliant from all of you, and so many different things to follow up on, but almost very assuring at the end, Dan, the points that, you know, there are lots of people that still haven't got the answers. So the fact that we're talking about this on a daily basis and trying to get on the same page feels like progress in itself. I thought we have a mixture of different examples within the Conservation Collective network, where we're funding projects from looking at seagrass in the Mediterranean to mangroves in the Caribbean, to seagrasses in Scotland. But I was wondering if Vinod, who's on the call, who's the director of our Lanka Environment Fund, might just speak for a couple of minutes about the projects he's working on there, and then, you know, that might naturally open up into questions, since I know he and I have burning questions related to those projects, as well as we can open up to everyone else. So I don't know, Vinod, if you speak, will you pop up on the screen, or Berta, do you need to?
Hello, hi everyone. Yeah, I just see everyone on the screen. Hope you can see me. Thank you to all the speakers for speaking and Conservation Collective for organizing this. Yeah, so we're in the phase 2 of Mark. That was really cool how you had the activities what we've had to go, because we've spoken for almost 2 years now, and like it's been such a journey for me to kind of navigate this space. Right now, I guess it's way more advanced from even the time like we got into it, because it was just so hard to navigate as to how you develop a project. And I spoke to so many people about how do you even begin, because it was super tough to understand actually, like, how do you navigate this new space. And carbon credits had somewhat of a negative connotation, especially in, we'll say, like developing countries like Sri Lanka. So it's like, how do you also, get government buy-in? Because I guess something land tenure I'm finding is extremely important when it comes to carbon credits. And that's a reality, because a lot of the big parcels that, some of the companies are looking at or projects are looking at are government land. So it's really tough, I guess. And we've had that issue despite commitments from the Sri Lankan government to actually get government back in. To a letter of support, as Dan said, ensuring that your governments, because the return on investment is, as all the speakers said, is 10 years or so. And because there isn't a lot of language on it as well, you find yourself, at least in the Sri Lankan context, there are certain people within the government mechanisms who understand it, but you're almost being an educator yourself and actually educating them about these things, and drawing parallels between the commitments we've made on an international level and how we need to honor them. And here's an opportunity that can potentially do that. So those are some of the conversations that I guess we end up having. Another thing is, I guess, the data gathering, because it can be quite expensive. So it's also that as well. And a lot of the funders that come in, it's almost like dangling a carrot in front of you, because they're happy to pay for that, but then it almost seems like there's a catch, like the credits get sold to them, and as Dan said, it can get sold in the market for varying values. So it's great to see, Mark, you talking about that fairness, and how you don't get caught to this carbon cowboy thing, because especially in, we'll say, developing country context, there can be connotations about multinational countries coming in, selling off the land. Those are political things. I'm not sure where everyone is from, but those are kind of things that you need to navigate as well. So I think having that traceability and kind of managing the government as well, and buying, almost going slowly, so you have that buy-in along the journey, and finding the right player who's willing to, I guess, take your market on. And in Sri Lanka, I guess what we've seen is, because it's so new, we've been lobbying this, and it's interesting because the area we've been working in is there's a lot of pressure from the government to degazette it for aquaculture area. So we've actually brought it in. It's very interesting how we've been able to, Blue Marine, actually, that Dan represents, is co-funding this project with us. And it's a seagrass assessment, the kind of first of its kind in Sri Lanka. And the idea is to, leverage the carbon there to say, this can be a nature-based solution. This can be a success story with the government, because this is the first area now. Mark's always spoken to me about, expanding it into the mangrove area. And I think we had a conference yesterday where, the issues coming up again. And one thing I wanted to start looking at is looking at that entire ecosystem as one area. You mentioned salt marshes, and looking at that big area and trying, I guess, to get that government buy-in now, because there is. And I guess in our context, we can also use conservation. It's almost a mechanism to conserve, we'll say here, because there's a lot of biodiversity, but the government, I guess, being a biodiversity hotspot, we can also spin it that way. But the government's also kind of in need of money in Sri Lanka. So there is an opportunity for that economic, but again, it's on that 10-year time scale. So it is kind of slow. When aquaculture is such a short turnaround, it's money in the bank, I guess, much quicker. So it's like, how do you have those trade-offs? And when Dan spoke about it, I would love to, I guess, see some of these standards have more leveraging biodiversity as well as part of it. If you're located along a Central Asian flyway, or estuary, or there's, other, like we've got dugongs in that area. So leveraging all of the presence of these animals, where that also increases the value of the credit as well. That would be phenomenal, because then you also can limit the overfishing and certain other activities that people are kind of reliant on it. And it's not just this one carbon credit that is, I guess, being sold on the market. You're selling almost like a payment ecosystem services, but a wider kind of blue carbon credit. So I mean, that's kind of it. We're going through this process, and it's been slow, but it's definitely catching on, I could say, and you just need to stick with it. These guys have been tremendous resources. I definitely urge you to check out the Fair Carbon website now that's on board, and because it's super helpful. It's been really helpful for me. So yeah, kind of that's it for me from Sri Lanka.
Amazing. Thank you, Vinod. Should we open up to questions from other people on the call? It's a big group. You can either stick up your hand or just shout out. There we go. Do I hear any questions there? Deathly silence. Oh, there we go. There was one in the chat. Oh, Karen, do you want to respond to Vinod? I think you've just put it in the...
Yeah, I've put it in the chat, but I think probably after listening to Mark, Dan, and myself, we can be quite down. I think those of us who are working in the space on the potential, and I don't think it's us being down on the potential. I think it's more kind of taking off the rose-colored spectacles of what the opportunities are and ensuring that there is a reality check on them. But I wanted to add that I think something that Vinod was talking about was really, really important, actually, a number of things. But one is just the land tenure issues. And this is particularly important in the ocean and coastal space because of who owns the land, what traditional rights are, and how those are governed. And so that's not just federal government, but also local government and then Indigenous communities. But the second point in terms of biodiversity value, so the coolest thing about these ocean and coastal systems is they're not just about storing carbon, right? They have all these other benefits, which are probably even more valuable when you begin to economically value them, but also the cultural values and the social values. And so looking at blue carbon as an entry point, but not a stopping point for that value. And there are lots of projects now underway to actually think about resilience value, resilience credits, and biodiversity credits. And I think that's where the excitement in the space is growing from, but it being critical, of course, that as that develops, that it's done in a manner that doesn't forget all these core elements. And this goes back to the point on patient capital and the role of philanthropy in the development of these projects to ensure, particularly for communities on the ground, that it isn't the multinationals coming in and taking those assets away, but that there's a way to develop these projects with communities, with input from local stakeholders, and with the scientific knowledge that's needed as the baseline to build upon as this whole kind of marketplace evolves.
Amazing. Thank you, Karen. There are a few questions in the chat now. Josephine, who's the chair of our Tuscany Environment Foundation, has asked about salt marshland restoration, and is that only in a kind of mangrove ecosystem, or would it work in a Mediterranean context? Don't know. Is that a Mark question?
I can answer that one happily. I think the Mediterranean's got fantastic potential for salt marsh. Honestly, I'll be looking at the regulatory environment and the levels of protection or not that the salt marsh areas you work with already have, and just honestly, that's going to be your biggest hurdle. Is the legal framework surrounding them, and then making sure that the work you do is additional So there has to be a threat or something that you can intervene in and change to make a difference. If you can meet those criteria, then the science behind salt marsh restoration and measuring the carbon stored within them is pretty good. We know that for biodiversity, these are critical bird habitats above anything else. And there's real potential there. I'd like to see it happen.
Great.
Almost remember someone working on it, but not quite. But do email me afterwards, and if I remember, I'll see if I can pick you up.
Perfect. I'll make a note of that. Questions coming in on the chat now. Samantha Dean says, what do you think it will take to channel real investment and funding into the blue carbon or ocean space if less than 1% is the figure Dan gave us, which is invested in coastal based and ocean solutions? Would carbon credits be better replaced by ecosystem credits or even bonds? Someone's pointed out here.
I think that's got to be one for Karen. I mean, she's making this happen. So,
well, I don't know. I think I'll try and answer it, and that is, the bottom line is there's got to be much more investment into the space regardless. And there's no, as Dan said, silver bullet or one solution. One thing that some of our partners are looking at the moment as we look at driving investment into the ocean and coastal space, the key issue, and this word was, it was, I think, the word of the COP in Egypt was de-risking. And an idea that is beginning to percolate is the idea of driving investment into coastal and ocean ecosystems, looking at blue carbon or biodiversity and resilience credits as guarantees that can be used to underpin those types of investments, which is a little kind of out there, but actually is an amazing idea. It just will mean a lot of work to create the valuations that are needed. But the idea being that if there is an investor who is interested in a sustainable blue economy project or investing in a marine reserve or something like that, and they're a bit nervous about where their investment may be going, that a government or a local community can guarantee some kind of a payout to that investment through a blue carbon credit as it's developed in the future, so that they would not be losing that investment, or it wouldn't be at risk. I probably am not explaining it that well. And the reason I'm probably not explaining it that well is because this is honestly an idea that is probably 6 months old in the space, but is something that as we look at growing the global ocean financial architecture and how to drive investment into the space, particularly the insurance sector is very interested in. And I think that that's something from the Alliance's point of view. We are beginning to work with the Insurance Development Forum, with our insurance partners at AXA, at Munich Re, at some of the reinsurers as well, and the brokers, to think about what the potential is there. Of course, the final point is, in order to do that, we need to go through all of those points that Dan and particularly Mark were talking about to create those valuations. But it is a potential and bodes, I think, an interesting opportunity for crowding investment into the space.
Amazing. Lots to think about there. Interestingly, Jim from Zurich Insurance was the next to ask a question. I don't know, Jim, if you want to just talk out loud rather than me reading people's questions.
Sure. Jim from Zurich. I was just wondering whether how we can create, it seems to me the awareness, the public awareness, corporate awareness, not on this call, obviously, but out in the wider public, of blue carbon is very low, and how we increase that. And I wondered if the terrestrial carbon credit creation schemes and nature restoration of a couple of years ago, everyone was competing with how many trees they could plant, whether that has created a bit of sort of wariness and cynicism amongst the public and how we counter that. Thanks.
I mean, I can take it. I don't know whether I have an answer specifically, but I think at the moment, everyone has quite rose-tinted spectacles about blue carbon. You know, I don't really, aside from one paper by Phil Williamson, I haven't really heard much in the way of cynicism. You know, people are incredibly enthusiastic about it, the concept of blue carbon. I think it certainly detects cynicism around carbon credits as a concept, and I know many companies are sort of moving away from that as a route to net zero. But I mean, going back up really to Samantha's question, because I can get answers to this one too. I do think that there's space and room and opportunity for a marine ecosystem recovery credit or some kind of ecosystem recovery credit that pays attention to carbon and gives companies some kind of contribution claim towards their progress, but also encompasses all of the other things that we've been talking about. And that was really my motivation for sort of working with Vera to set up the Vera Seascape Carbon Initiative, with the goal of sort of expanding Vera's methodologies to incorporate multiple different habitats and multiple different things. Now, I think I was probably pretty rose-tinted at that point too, and didn't realize how much evidence was needed and complications they were in that route, and that's all going to take some time. But I'd say that probably will be the direction of travel. And coming back to your point, Jim, like, when a product is created of sufficiently high quality, that should overcome the cynicism. And by the way, I really like planting trees too. I just saying.
Can I just add one quick thing? Because I think the point that's critical here as well is that as we develop the kind of potential investment portfolio in the space, the focus on nature-based solutions is critical, and that we don't just focus on blue carbon. So, Jim, I'm not sure if you've got Zurich, but I'm assuming that's Zurich Re. But
we don't hear from him. It is Zurich. Yeah, maybe he's on mute.
Okay. Well, I think, you know, they are really interesting they're interesting data points now to show that nature-based solutions can be 15 times more cost effective than kind of standard concrete solutions like seawalls, that they are more durable, that they are more adaptable. You know, a seawall starts degrading as soon as you stop building it. A mangrove continues to grow and becomes stronger and more adaptive with time. And I think that that's part of the story we need to tell here, and the story that needs to be invested in, so that as this marketplace is developing and as some of these guardrails and safeguards are being put around it, there is the investment going into other known nature-based solutions that could become the source of the biodiversity or the resilience or the blue carbon credits of the future. And so there are things that can be done now in terms of those immediate investments, as well as looking at the patient capital development of these markets in the longer term.
Just quickly, just build on what Karen and Dan have just said. It's only taken probably about a year to drive the conversation from here's blue carbon, how do we get involved in this, to, okay, we've now got wider awareness that, you know, we have a set of principles, there's a couple of other products along a similar line. We're trying to define a responsible marketplace with a wider understanding of all these different elements. So if we think ahead, what can we do in the coming year? I don't think it's unrealistic to see if we can start reframing this as a, you know, that everyone focuses on these projects as their carbon credit projects powered by nature. And maybe we need to see if we can start shifting this around to being these nature projects, and these are human projects that are powered by carbon credits. So we can flip that. And then as we learn and understand how to quantify some of the other effects of these projects, whether that's resilience, whether that's biodiversity, and define metrics we can use to measure the impact of these projects in other spaces too, then I think the conversation becomes easier, because it's not just carbon as the sole monetary driver behind project development. We're bringing in other elements, so the more holistic picture becomes more visible. It's just going to take a bit of time, and I think for all of us, the priority was on safeguarding the way this market took shape, and that's not going to be something that is solved now. We've made the first step towards doing, but yeah, I think there's space now to try and change that narrative and bring the whole picture into focus, not just myopic carbon, carbon, carbon.
I think that's really helpful. And I think particularly as the Conservation Collective, when we're asked for a menu of projects related to marine ecosystem restoration, it also brings so many more opportunities for funding, because there are all the different angles that you've mentioned, and we have much better access at alternative livelihood programs or biodiversity programs, which may not tick the carbon box immediately, but may ultimately lead towards that. A couple of more questions in the chat. Vicky was asking about, Vicky, do you want to ask your question directly? I imagine it's...
Sure, yeah. Vicky Spooner from Falmouth Harbour. Really interested in this space. We've been doing a bit about seagrass regeneration within our waters on our own seabed. And it would be great to do more of that and fund that sustainably. So we paying lots of attention to the marine net gain consultation that the government recently put out. We're within a protected area here in Falmouth. So really interested about the additionality concept and how to work with that. Obviously, we have certain responsibilities and we need to go over and above that to be able to, charge for biodiversity net gain or credits in any way, shape or form. So just wondered how you felt about the sort of the consultation, because it seemed to imply that additionality may be set aside to facilitate marine net gain in some way.
Who wants to take this? I'm seeing Mark.
I can take a stab at it. I haven't caught up yet on the whole marine net gain conversation, so I'm really behind on that. But I can say that when it comes to carbon crediting and credits which are issued by any of the major standards that are functioning at the moment, their requirements are for additionality. It's not a legislative requirement anywhere else. So for them, they're not going to change that and make an exception for the UK, because then they're going to get everyone saying make an exception for us, and then their ability to argue that they're making a difference, it starts to weaken, and they come under so much fire and for what they're doing that they can't afford to weaken that. Yeah, it's a shame, because proving additionality is intensely difficult a lot of the time, because you're modelling, a future that may or may not happen against another future that may or may not happen. So it's hard, but yeah, that need for additionality to produce a tradable credit is not going to disappear. But maybe the UK government will produce an alternative route to funding that work.
Thank you. Olivia, do you want to go next? Or I can potentially ask her question. Don't know if
I know I was hi everyone, thanks for organizing it. It's very interesting, and all offsets, not just blue carbon. I'm seeing so many different offset trading platforms and like these new certification bodies, and are they what you call the carbon cowboys, or who can you really trust that they're doing the due diligence on the fairness of these credits as well?
I mean, I can say a little bit on that. I think a lot of those sort of basically online digital platforms that are set up to market credits, and as a consequence of their sale, receive some kind of profit, are quite well intentioned. I don't really see them as they're effectively trying to create an intermediary market between projects and investors. I mean, I think they're well intentioned, but ultimately possibly most of them are quite deluded, because that's not really the problem here. There's a phenomenal amount of corporate appetite and demand and everything else. It's not in how these things are marketed. It's the fact that there's no supply of projects or credible projects. And so while I don't think that necessarily all of those people could be considered kind of carbon cowboys, I'd say they might just be barking up the wrong tree when it comes to their business model. Because there's not really an incentive for most bona fide projects, at least of a certain scale, will already be talking to lots of people who could provide them with investment. So I haven't seen a platform yet that makes me think, wow, that's really adding value to the space. I mean, I think possibly carbon cowboys is a broad term, and it's not really defined what it is, but I think there's a lot of people who see pound or dollar signs here and in a fairly exploitative way are seeking to put a small amount of money in and take a large amount of money out in terms of their profit. And that is a real risk and a problem. And I think I refer back to Karen's the principles that Karen referenced as a good way to kind of try to navigate that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
I'll quickly jump on that too. I've definitely seen websites trading what they call carbon credits, and there is no indication of which crediting agency has released these credits. And a lot of the time, there are websites trading what they call carbon credits that have not been issued by one of the major accreditation agencies at all. Some of them don't even exist. Like there is one project that I have spoken to several times where they are selling, they've stopped calling carbon credits now, I think they call it a carbon benefit package, but 99.6% of the claimed carbon reductions they are selling does not, cannot, and will ever happen. So there's absolutely fraudulent websites out there. I don't really regard them as part of the voluntary carbon market. If there's fraudsters and there's fakes and there's all sorts of dodgy stuff going on around the edges, it's a bit like bootlegging in the music industry. You've got people who are releasing albums and everything else, then you've got people who are copying them and selling them on the side. This is quite a dated reference now I think about it. But it's much the same thing. If you need to, whom can you trust? If they're not, whoever website it is, if they're not openly sharing who issued that credit, so you know what it is you're buying, then go to a different website. Don't go any further. Because if it's a valid credit, then whoever's trading it will want to have the issuer upfront and visible, because that's where their value is. That's how they're going to sell it. So that's your first glance thing to find out if you can trust it. And if they are quoting an agency as having issued that credit, and you want to double check, you can look up the registry of that crediting agency, and every single credit that they've ever issued is in there and tracked. So you can't see who owns it, but you can see, that it exists and it's available to trade. So those are two tools that really give you a good starting point.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I was going to mention briefly that I'm sitting here with Amanda, who's director of our Devon Environment Foundation, and we funded a very early stage part of a pilot project related to a seaweed farm. And there is a platform here, and I think they're in the UK, and rather than focusing on verified credits, it's development capital to grow projects. So they linked up bioalgae with innocent smoothies, yes. I think it was. So there's actually kind of ways of growing the project in a without, whether obviously, which is exactly what we're talking about, how many other ways we can develop this market and get these projects growing and to scale.
And they're actually looking at doing some proper research for finding out what carbon is being sequestered by seaweed genuinely, and we haven't really spoken about seaweed today, so I guess that's probably quite cutting edge. So watch this space.
Well, I am just seeing that we've got a question from James Morris about Indonesia. James, do you want to ask? And then I should check how we're doing for time. I haven't checked at all. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. Are you still there, James?
I'm still here. Thank you very much. I feel like this could be a rabbit hole with limited time left. But I've been volunteering on the ground in Indonesia in this project area, and there seems to be quite some confusion around the possibility of international finance and international actors becoming involved in the Indonesia blue carbon space. And I wondered if any of the experts on the call had experience in this space and what their understanding was of the current regulatory environment.
Does anyone want to take it?
I don't want it to be me again. I can.
You're the only one who's actually worked on the ground in Indonesia, so I think you're probably the best.
Okay, I had a shot at this. I mean, the regulatory landscape in Indonesia is changing quickly. And I think some of the meetings I've been lucky enough to hear from this year, I've heard very different things only a few weeks apart. So it's confusing. I don't have a clear answer. The latest thing I heard is that private investment in certainly mangroves for generating carbon credits, you can invest in a project if you want, but whether or not government decides to release the permission to sell those credits in another country there's still a question mark over when that will happen. Since that moratorium on selling credits generated in Indonesia happened last year, I've heard several dates for it being raised, ranging up to about 2030. So it could be any time between next week and then, depending how everything pans out. And there's a lot of discussion about, there's the National Mangrove Restoration Plan with 600,000 hectares or something that they're working on at the moment. It's very top down, so it's going to be hard to see exactly how impactful it is in the short term. But there seem to be plans based around debt for nature swaps with a focus on the carbon that Indonesia can generate from their mangrove systems. So that's the latest I've heard. I'm sorry, you probably know way more about it than I do at the moment. And if you ever want to catch up, and I'd be interested to find out from you what's going on where you're actually based there.
Thanks, Mark. That's the end of the questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone else in the general room has anything they'd like to share or a last minute chat. We're going to take a silence.
Victoria? Victoria
Yeah,
has her hand.
Hi, Liz. Yes, can you see me? Thank you, first of all, to all the speakers. This has been fascinating for us, and I've got one of my grantees on the call too from IC, and we're really fascinated by everything being explained. And we recently completed a project in the northeast area of Corfu in the Ionian Islands, and IC essentially found out through their rhizome analysis that there were 600 tons of organic blue carbon sequestered there. Now, bearing in mind, as you were saying, about the markets being approximately, the UK market's $40 per ton, we're talking about a value of $24,000, or pounds. Would this be worth, as you were saying, I think it was Dan, you were saying, you have to check whether or not the value is worth investing into the carbon credit system. Would that be a large enough area? It's about 25 hectares. I mean, it's nothing compared to the areas you've been talking about. So that's sort of my first question. And then connected to that is, it wasn't completely clear to me in the first slide about the 10 steps for gaining carbon credits as to whether or not an area has to be recognised as protected before you can apply for those carbon credits.
I mean, I'll take just the start of it, because otherwise it will be Mark again. But Mark will have a better idea on this. But just building on what he said previously about salt marsh potential in the Med. From what I understand, all European Mediterranean seagrass is protected under Natura 2000, and theoretically, unless you're adjusting that protection quite substantially to ward off some kind of threat, I don't quite understand personally where the additionality would come from, if you see what I mean. So you say there's 600 tons in a store underneath the however many hectares it was.
25. Yeah.
25 hectares of Posidonia. Fantastic. But I guess my question to you would be, what change in management use are you conducting that improves that results in additional carbon sequestration that could then be quantified and in some way turned into credits?
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, essentially, the study was initially implemented because we were trying to draw attention to this area in lieu of a potential marine development that was due to take place. And so it was informing an overall report where we were attempting to sort of proclaim this area as an important region of biodiversity and carbon sequestering, etc. And, you know, to date, that development and marine development has been halted. But in terms of thinking about what we could do as an additional management strategy to protect it, I mean, we're not sort of at that stage yet. I don't know if Roxanne on the call wants to come in and say anything in addition to that, but it was just whether or not. So are you saying that you can add further value by having a clear management strategy, connecting to the local community, and that would perhaps incentivize investment in protecting it? Is that what you're suggesting?
I mean, I think there's an avoided threat in the form of the potential development, but as that has already been, as that's not happening, I still am struggling to see where the additionality comes from. So I see Annie put into the chat, there's a lot of anchoring. So I guess theoretically you could, although I believe it's already protected under the habitats and under the Natura 2000, which would make it should be protected from anchoring already. But to say you could quantify the avoided threat from proving that there was no further anchoring within those 25 hectares, potentially through eco moorings and monitoring and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Potentially there's some kind of quantification of avoided threat there. Yes. But I mean, Mark, what do you think? It's hard to I just think the quantums might be quite small for you to go through that considerable amount of work. However, that's not to say that it shouldn't be done. Like, it absolutely should be done. It's just whether there's a credit outcome at the end of it or not.
Yes, that's what I was curious about.
I'm just hailing from Barbados. Hey guys. So for me, this whole topic of blue carbon credits, etc., I've just been thinking, well, Barbados is like so small. I mean, like, in the grand scheme of things, are we really gonna be able to, have this economic viability that Karen was talking about earlier? But the mangrove restoration project that we've been working on, I mean, that was not why we started it at all. It was mainly just restoring nature. We've got just about 3% of mangrove habitats left in Barbados as a result of coastal development. You know, a whole lot of fancy hotels. Tourism is like our biggest thing. And so we've had a really lovely family. This is their private land on 277 acres. And they have an estuary there, and they wanted to turn that into a climate resilience lab. And so that is where our project got started. But, you know, we still don't have any type of infrastructure for this type of carbon credits in the markets, et cetera. It's still very new for me and for BECT, and there's so much to learn. I'm just wondering, moving forward, you know, like what really is the next step for such a small island? I mean, I know we have our blue bonds that our Prime Minister has been working on, and like recently just came through. So it's just a whole lot going on in this space. And, you know, we're over here as conservationists doing what we're passionate about. And then on the international market, it's just like, oh, blue carbon credits, you know, we have to just try to now jump into all of this. Really just needing some guidance as to how to really start this process, working with our governments, our international bodies. I mean, I know we've gone through all the chats today, but it can still feel like so much to process. If you had to give me one first step, like what is that for me? What is that for BECT?
Great question. Karen, do you want to jump in?
I'm going to jump in at risk, potentially. But, I think I would actually focus on the conservation work that you're doing and look at the Blue Bond as an opportunity to get investment into your work as a project, and keep a watch on the evolution of this market. There are initiatives in the Caribbean focused on actually doing some pooling of sites, potential kind of developing a regional blue carbon market. But I think the key you can do is focus on the project at the moment and just keep an eye out. Check out what, you know, Fair Carbon is doing and what they're saying. Maybe Blue Marine can be encouraged to work in Barbados. But rather than jump into the space immediately, focus on the conservation work. You should be able to get investment into Barbados through that mechanism rather than the Blue Bond at the moment, and just keep an eye on it for the future.
Yeah, because it just feels like there's so many people coming to you at once, like wanting to do stuff, and you really have to be careful, as Mark was outlining. You know, there's a lot of stuff out there, but, you know, who can you really trust? So this has been very helpful. I appreciate it. And thank you to CC and the team for putting this lovely talk together today. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Che. Basically just did my roundup for me as well. And I think that kind of last piece of advice, which is kind of develop projects, make them a success, prove it, and kind of keep connected regionally and globally is a nice way to round up as well. So yeah, just to say thank you so much for all of you and your time, for Mark and your 10 steps, which makes you sound a bit like a Alcoholics Anonymous, but you know, they have had lots of success as well. Karen and the 5 principles that you've shared in the chat, but we'll also share the high quality blue carbon principles guidance with everyone to read. And you know, I think I will definitely take into consideration the words around philanthropy and patient capital and sophisticated capital, and some of the points kind of Dan made around how we can mitigate some of these risks. And I think, you know, what we're all about, which is shared learnings and replicating success stories. I just hope within this group we can do a lot more of that. So thank you all so much for coming and for speakers, and we will follow up with sharing slides and recordings if everyone's happy with that. Excellent.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.